Good morning, everyone. How is everyone doing? Making it through the pandemic, I hope. Anyway, I'm Frank O'Brien. I've been a volunteer over at InfoAge for about 15 years, mostly in a role of me as a solar system ambassador for NASA. And I give regular lectures there. It's one of those things that, again, I've always had a passion for space flight. I've presented at TCF for years on the Apollo computer and the shuttle computers. And today, we're going to be talking about a completely different system, but one that's hugely important, both in terms of its use in the United States and also how it advanced technology all over the industry. And so now we get a chance to go see if I can master all this clever stuff. Let me know if you can see my screen share.
We can see it.
Oh, super. Great, great, great. Anyway, let's see if I can get this going. All right, we're going to start with what might seem like an imaginary scenario. Of course, the events of the last few weeks make this perhaps not so imaginary. But as you can imagine, tensions between the United States and Russia, they're as high as ever before. And again, remember, this is a fictional story, maybe fictional. Nobody wants war. So far, we've been lucky. Peace has prevailed. But the militaries are suspicious of each other. And well, that's the kind of life we're living now. Anyway, oops. Now, 24 hours a day. Radars, huge radars, all across the United States and Canada are looking for any kind of sign for a potential attack. They're connected to massive computer complexes and interact with one another over these very fast, high-speed data links so that the military has a great situational awareness of the airspace around North America. And these radars are the ones that will give us our very first insight on the possibility of some sort of attack. Now, military technicians are constantly monitoring the skies over the North Pole. Commercial aircraft frequently fly in and out of this area as that is the shortest route between Europe, Asia, and North America. Now, every aircraft has a well-defined flight plan, which is all stored on the computers and cross-references with the tracks on the radar. And honestly, we can argue that this is a tedious, if not completely routine job. Now, one day, imagine an aircraft is coming over the North Pole, heading toward the States. Now, a quick check of flight plans turns up empty and an intercept is ordered. Now, this doesn't happen very often. It really doesn't, but it does happen and it's not especially alarming. And, a fighter aircraft is set up to visually identify the plane and try to establish contact. Now, understand again, this is a routine exercise, but it usually finds that there's a navigation or a radio problem, and the FAA is coordinated with, and they get the plane safely on their way. But in this scenario, imagine that now we have that one plane, and it's followed by waves and waves of bombers, and it's obvious we're under attack from Russia. Pilots are all scrambled to their fighters and they get strapped in. And as they're getting all the planes fired up, all the computers that have been doing all the tracking update. The computers on the aircraft, navigation systems are updated, and all the tracking information is updated on the aircraft's course and altitude. And after the planes get in the air, the computers on the ground automatically guide the aircraft and guides the fighter to the target. Whoops, come on. Sometimes technology fails me. Now, with the aircraft flying completely automatically towards a target it can't see, it's miles away, the pilot needs to have a big picture of the upcoming conflict. So there's a large screen in the cockpit that presents situational awareness of the upcoming battle, including the target's location and the fighter's location relative to the whole battle space. Now, this display is constantly updated from the ground. as the fighter is then maneuvered into position for its attack. Whoops, wrong way. And so once the bogey gets into the fighter's radar range, the pilot takes control, chooses his weapon of choice, fires, and goes home to beer call. And hopefully the end of the world is now prohibited. In many cases, this is going to be a nuclear tipped missile because they're a lot more effective than traditional air-to-air. So after destroying the target, the onboard computer returns the aircraft to base. Now, this is a really clever, neat little scenario, isn't it? And honestly, it's something that you might expect, to read. Oh, come on. It's something that you might expect to read in, with a current aerospace magazine like Air and Space, or maybe you have some dystopian, sci-fi novel that you like. This was 1958. Think about this. Okay, all those fun little images were, pulled off the web, and, they're all from the current day. But all of this was implemented in 1958. The system was called SAGE, the Semi-Automatic Ground Environment. Only the military can come up with a name like that. And it was conceived in the early 50s. After billions of dollars spent, and this is in the 50s, this is 1950s billions of dollars, it was far larger than the Manhattan Project, and it created the largest and most sophisticated networked computer system in the world. This was pushing technology far beyond what was possible at the time, and it was a revolutionary, fully computerized air defense system. Its primary purpose? To detect, intercept, and destroy Soviet bombers coming over to North America. Now, even though idea of a centralized air defense system, had been considered since the Second War, and right after the Second War, we had effectively nothing defending the United States. There was no technology after the Second War that was even close to being able to accomplish this. To do this, we needed the largest and most sophisticated computer ever built. Whoops. The origins of SAGE go back to 1951, and this is the Whirlwind 1 computer. It was originally designed to do aircraft simulation studies. They wanted to try out handling characteristics of any kind of new design, but the Navy got tired of it. It was getting rather expensive, and the Air Force used it to study the idea of using it to plan real-time intercepts of incoming bombers. Now, understand the key point here. This is just a few years after the first computer, ENIAC, came online. This is 1951. That's only 5 years after the first computer comes up. Whirlwind 1 was the first real-time, fully interactive computer. By any standard, it really wasn't particularly fast, and it only performed about 20,000 instructions a second. It did have clever innovations, though. There were 16 computation units, which did your add, subtract, multiply, divide. Not quite what we would consider a core in today's processors, but it did do a good division of work. Importantly, it had a powerful I/O architecture. Much of its lack of speed was due to its really, really slow storage tube memory. And this was a terrible hobbling, part of the system. They were slow and unreliable. But processing speed increased fourfold with a radical breakthrough invention of core memory. This was the very first practical implementation of core in any computer. Now, this sounds like a really great idea. Let's practice aircraft intercepts. But the problem was all the radars were purely analog and they didn't talk to one another. So we had to build interfaces that took the analog data, reported azimuth, altitude, that sort of thing, range, and digitally send it to a computer. This was brand new. No one had ever done digital work for the radar before, but they had to do it. And data had to be transmitted over the only thing that was possible at the time, a standard telephone line. This was a revolutionary achievement, and the first couple iterations of their work didn't really work particularly well, but it was enough of a proof of concept to show that we could build something called SAGE. Whoops. There we go. Anyway, starting in 1953, the Air Force, MIT, and IBM all began designing its successor machine, the Whirlwind 2. This is an utterly massive computer system specifically built to perform all the tasks of an air defense system. Later known by its military designation called the ANFSQ-7, again, it's a military thing, the computer was far more advanced than a few other systems of the day. Each processor, what we would consider just the processor, weighed about 250 tons. And it would be connected with high speed. Okay, there are 1,200 bits a second, but that's high speed today, not gigabit. 1,300 bits a second data links to both the radar sites and to missile sites controlled. Now, transistors had only been recently introduced to the marketplace, and their reliability and production rates were just far below what they would need to build such a system. And as a result, we had to build SAGE using vacuum tubes. But they were very high reliability vacuum tubes. Now, if the word vacuum tube and high reliability seems like the perfect oxymoron, you can be forgiven. But yeah, the early tubes were really, really lousy. And we're going to be polite and just say lousy. But they ended up finding a breakthrough in understanding why tubes failed so often and so badly. With this huge, again, yes, a breakthrough. It's a breakthrough in vacuum tube, but it was important. The idea that SAGE now could be considered a reliable computer. You weren't replacing tubes every few minutes. You had to have a very high reliability system for all of this. Now, in each SAGE installation, we see a great picture of a massive computer here, and this is actually just a small section of it. There were actually two processors, identical ones. One was always active, and one was always on standby. The primary system was always providing updates to the secondary in the event that it might go down so that we wouldn't lose any data. But the standby system wasn't always simply mirroring the primary. Often, it was busy undergoing everything from, training exercises, maintenance, and that sort of thing. IBM was the prime contractor of SAGE, and Burroughs and Western Electric were also providing huge essential components for this overall system. This is just one of the arithmetic units. There were two of them. The second one is a little bit off to the left in the background. The processor by today would hold its own on paper. It was a full 32-bit machine. It had one's complement math, which we can argue about how smart that is. And it had 68K of this fabulous, fabulous core memory. Now, many of the operations were done on half words, 16 bits, which sounds like you're really sacrificing a lot of stuff. But the idea is in each register, breaking it into two different things, you're able to do two simultaneous operations at a time. Precision to extreme number of digits wasn't really all that important at the time. Radars and altitudes don't have to be precise to 10 decimal digits. We just really want to get you in the general area. fighter speeds, fuel consumption rates, and yes, Sage tracked your fuel consumption. All of this, as long as it was good to 2 or 3 digits, we were more than happy. It was certainly better than anything else that we had. Now think of this. We're talking 16 bits, again, a 32-bit word. We're talking 68K. It had a main 64K and a 4K offset. That's what we use to defend the United States against nuclear war. Just let that soak in for a bit. Think about that twice. This was the state-of-the-art technology of its time. Armageddon was going to be fought with vacuum tubes, and it was actually pretty good. Now it's I/O capability. Remember, computers, it's huge. You got to get, data in and out for a computer to be useful. Now it's easy to say that each Sage processor controlled about 150 radar displays, the radars themselves, missile batteries, and the actual fighter aircraft itself. It did, but not directly. And we're going to see a little bit more about this in a bit. There was no operating system that we think of today. There was no interrupts, no time slicing, nothing like that. It was fully real time, but it was just a tiny, tiny few bytes of code just going around in a loop, dispatching work. So again, don't try to compare this to any Unix flavor or Mac or Windows. This was really primitive. And remember, we didn't have a lot of storage. It was all really dedicated to just the application. This idea of real time, again, was revolutionary. Aside from World War I, there was no real-time computers. And that was, of course, a huge, 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 vast improvement from batch-oriented systems. It would be kind of silly if nuclear Armageddon is coming and you're waiting on someone to punch in information with a deck of cards. Batch systems were really the standard until the early mid-60s. This was a decade ahead of all that. Now, with a processor speed of, again, 80,000 instructions a second, that's pretty limited horsepower to be driving all of those peripherals. Much of the heavy lifting of data moving in and out and the preliminary analysis was actually done by the peripherals, not in the processor. It saved, a tremendous amount of cycles. And with that, we're going to be going into a bit of detail on that in a moment. 64K of memory. Geez, that just looks beautiful, doesn't it? 64K, 32 bits. And this was the key part of the magic of Sage. I mean, it's huge. I mean, 64K. I mean, think of it. Yeah, and I have a 64K on my desktop machine somewhere too. No, 64 gig. Oh, geez, it's only 1 million times bigger. Now, again, remember at the time, computing storage, what we would think of as core memory, was all done in storage tubes, where an electron beam writes something onto a screen, another electron beam reads it. This was terribly slow and also breathtakingly unreliable. If you could get a couple hours of use out of it before it started dying, you were doing pretty good. Core memory, especially when you had MIT and the military and all the rest working on it, became hugely, hugely reliable. And this was one of the magics to how well the Sage system ran. Memory access time was not bad, especially for the early 50s. It was 20 microseconds. And for core, that's not terribly bad, especially as something that was just coming into production. Whoops, there we go. Now, data is the lifeblood of any computer, and especially a battle management system, which is really what Sage did. Sage had tons of storage, well, by its day. Discs were just now starting to come out of the labs, and honestly, they simply weren't ready for prime time. But drums were being used, and they were quite reliable. They really were. The capacity wasn't a lot. We're talking maybe 150K on a drum. And again, these are 150K of 32-bit words. And there were about 14 drums on each system. Now, we get the idea that, okay, data storage, it's going to be a large amount of static data. And there was certainly it. But the major function of drum storage on Sage was for data exchange between the primary system and the standby, and also between the processors and their peripherals, the radars, the displays, the fighters, etc. As the primary system processed all this important data, it also updated a drum that was read by the standby system. If it was up. The process is, we would think of this as just, the two processor synchronization like we find in, any kind of high availability system. But they had a wonderful little phrase for it. Instead of synchronization and all the rest, they called it cross-telling, because it's telling the computer across the aisle, okay, yeah, it's military. If the primary system were to go down, the secondary system would be immediately brought up, and then it would read from the cross-telling drum. The idea being, this is effectively what we would think of today as a checkpoint. And it would pick up right where the primary system left off. Automatically, all the other I/O devices, the displays, the radars, and all the rest would be switched over. It was a really pretty clever way of doing things. So we're going to talk again a little bit more about that later. Now, to drive a bunch of displays, and we'll take a look at them in a bit, to drive all of these displays, you need to have a lot of interaction with your data. The processors just simply didn't have the horsepower for something like that. So the processor simply wrote the data to a drum. The radar display or some of the other systems would just simply read from the drum, not bother the processor with interrupts and all the rest. Again, this was a crazy system. It didn't have interrupts in the traditional sense that we think of today. All the information, radar tracks, geographic information, all that other good stuff was all stored on the drum. So it just simply read it, interpreted the data, and put it on the display. Didn't bother the processor. And so this was probably, again, one of the great advancements in, for lack of a better phrase, distributed computing. In 1953, this was pretty clever. Radars, which were off-site, and they were scattered all over the country, when they sent their data in, they just simply had that data written to a drum where the computer, when it got around to it, grabbed from the, when the processor grabbed from the drum, figured out, okay, there's a bad guy coming and he's at this position. And then it would do whatever computations and make that data available for the radar displays. Again, switchover was just a couple minutes to do this. This is, again, today that's considered reasonably good. Now, we think of a room full of radar consoles. Through a quick set of, tapping of switches, if I lost one of my radar consoles, one or two switch flips, poof, I can have a different console bring up the same data. Again, it wasn't stored locally in the processor. It wasn't stored on the radar display. You just configured a new scope to look for a particular track on a drum. This was a huge flexibility because, again, we are talking the 50s and things aren't always as reliable as we'd like. Now, we talked about the day when we have airliners, excuse me, go away. We have airliners that need to be tracked and compared against their flight plans. Well, airlines and private pilots, of course, didn't have computers, and there wasn't an automated flight planning system anywhere. It didn't exist. Computers, again, were just curiosities. There was certainly no sense of computerized flight scheduling systems. Now, in order for Sage to be aware of all the different flights that it might potentially have to track, not just over the North Pole, but all across the country, every day, armies of folks had to type in this data manually onto punch cards after contacting the airlines, after contacting the FAA to get all the flight plans for all the planes that were going to be flying that day. All of that then have to be fed in and written out to all the drums. Again, we'll talk in a bit, but think of what it was like in the 50s if you wanted to book a flight without computers. That's such a crazy thought. Because each Sage site had two processors. There was a central room where all the maintenance and operations were coordinated. Now, each system had its own maintenance service console lined up against the wall. This is looking right down the center aisle, and poof, this is basically the ops area for the two systems. All the while the system's running, hardware is checking other hardware to make certain that everything is running fine. Everything from parity checking to, did this addition actually add up, 2 + 2 = 4? Make certain there was no electrical faults. Make certain the power supplies are all working correctly. When a system went down for standby operation and everything got switched over, there were far, far more exhaustive checks. Remember those vacuum tubes that we were all really proud that they were getting pretty reliable? Well, each one of them was tested down to a certain margin to see if it was getting ready to fail. And occasionally they did find failing tubes. While the standby system was down, maintenance period is happening, they went out, swapped out all the bad tubes. When the system came up, everything was fresh and ready. And all of this was, again, done and coordinated through these large maintenance consoles, one for the primary and secondary. Now, checking every one of the 50,000 vacuum tubes sounds like, a pretty big job, and it was. And this sounds like a little bit of overkill. But understand, again, for some of us folk who aren't nearly as young as we'd like to be, understand if a system was running more than a few hours a day without a crash, we were actually kind of happy. With this setup, Sage had, over the course of a year, at most 4 hours of unscheduled downtime. Over an entire year, that's, a bunch of nines, 99 point whatever percent. We didn't have that kind of reliability in our general machines until probably the year 2000. And this is the mid-50s. They did good work on this. Now, before we move on, just one thing. Take a good look at this slide and keep those maintenance consoles in mind. We're going to get back to them in a bit. Now, over 70 consoles, in some installations up to 90, like these were used, these were the radar screens, used to track and identify aircraft in a particular sector. Screen was 16 inches across, which is a good size, and it displayed first a geographical overlay, which showed where cities and towns and all the rest was, navigation information, notably radio navigation aids or airports or checkpoints, that kind of thing, and icons for planes and alphanumeric lettering for each target that they're tracking. This is in the mid-50s. This was science fiction. Now, one of the things you notice, there's a whole heck of a lot of lights, buttons, and switches. They never used a traditional keyboard. Instead, all the information was entered through all of the little buttons on the side. And yes, A through Z, 0 through 9, plus all the different functions that you needed to do, like track, stop tracking, update altitudes, these kind of things. Everything had a push button that was set up that was then read by the processor, and information was then sent back to the screen. Now, high persistence phosphors for, again, this is all vacuum tube driven CRTs. High persistence phosphors were only just now being invented. Yellow was kind of the best color that they could really have with any kind of high persistence. And so that became the dominant color. It turns out today that's kind of true too, but of course nobody uses CRTs. In order to improve the contrast, folks in the operations area, the radar areas, were all under very dim lighting. And that's kind of true. There's also great psychological reasons, which we can go into on dim lighting in high stress environments. But it also was lit up with a dark blue light. And again, this helped the contrast on the screen so that you could see your targets much easier. Now, it's difficult to see, and I don't know if my cursor is coming up, but right up in here on the main console screen, right below the couple rotary switches, there's an artifact that was really, really common in the 50s and 60s on the upper left. Any idea, any guesses on what that could be? Any thoughts? It's an ashtray. Yeah, these were the days when everyone smoked. And who is going to deny a soldier his last cigarette as World War III unfolds? Now, this is all very groovy. This is a wonderful screen, lots of push buttons and a fancy screen and all the rest. Now, your job is to be coordinating aircraft that are flying in and out of your airspace. You could have a whole bunch of them on your screen. You want to do something with a particular target. There's no keyboards. How are you going to select a specific aircraft out of the whole screen full of them that you're looking at? Thoughts?
Light pointer.
That's what we got. IBM invented the light gun. And here, there's a little pin on there that was used to put up against the screen, not to identify the target, but to get a precise length for the lens to focus properly on the screen. That's all it was used for. You press the trigger, a little flash went across the screen, it figured out the timing and all the rest, and you were able to identify where that target was on the screen, and the processor and everything else is updated, and you could start doing your fancy switch flipping. This is a great, great invention. And I use light pens, of course, modern ones, well into the 80s on the IBM mainframes that I worked on. I don't know if there's any really young folks here, but if you look up in the upper right corner, anyone have an idea what that is? Come on. There must be all old folk on here. That's a shame, but oh well. Anyway, this is just a staged beauty shot kind of picture. I don't know why a staff sergeant is there and why a lieutenant colonel is hanging over his shoulder, but you can bet he's going to be paying attention. And yeah, you just sit there and you go click, click, click onto the screen, and you see the guy in the back punching up data on the back. This is how you interacted with your scopes and your screens and all the other fun stuff. Now, you have 90 scopes, you have a military hierarchy, and there is a proper way of doing things. In any large organization trying to coordinate lots and lots of data. At the top of the pyramid, there was, we can call them the general surveillance group. And this was air traffic, basically air traffic control, but they weren't doing much controlling. The FAA took care of that. So if you get a bogey on your screen, the track would be passed to a weapons director who would decide what kind of response would be done. And depending on the threat, he could scramble a fighter or assign an anti-aircraft missile battery to take out the bomber. If a fighter was sent up, control was passed to an intercept director who would monitor the encounter and ensure SAGE was correctly maneuvering, to the target. In low tension times, if they think it's going to be, an off-course airliner, the intercept director would just say, call up the FAA and say, we're going to figure out this guy for you. Now, with all of this, and I'm hopefully going to be running right on time here, almost done, with such a monstrous set of processors, displays and all the rest, we needed a huge building. And the SAGE infrastructure was as big as you can imagine. It was enclosed in this huge blockhouse, 4 stories high and about 150 feet on a side. And although it wasn't supposed to survive a nuclear attack, 6-foot thick concrete reinforced walls are pretty sturdy. And the smaller section off to the right is just the cooling and the power generating plant. Each one required about 3 megawatts. And with all those tubes, about a third of that power was just for the air conditioning. There's about 24 SAGE sites built, and one of them, and the very first one, is not too far from the college in New Jersey. McGuire Air Force Base had the very first SAGE system. Anyway, we're not gonna dwell on this. This is the cross section of a SAGE building. One entire floor was just for the 2 processors. The top floor was where all the radar screens were. Bottom floor, all the telephony equipment, everything coming in. And of course, you can see the powerhouse and all the rest. This is the big board. There you have it. It's not as fancy or as big as you might have expected. This was really the nerve center where all the command and control of World War III would be done. And although it's kind of small and Spartan, military commanders could bring up any display they wanted to get proper real-time situational awareness of how the battle is starting to unfold. Phone lines were set up to all the units in the field so that they can, get their high-level orders out. And again, it doesn't look, the glamorous and huge and expansive as Hollywood, will let you think. But to have this kind of capability in the mid-50s, right after the Korean War, to watch war in real time, this was just science fiction. Anyway, the big board's alive. And although it might be a little bit tough to make out, and again, I don't know if you can see my cursor, here's the coast of Jersey, here is Long Island, you can see Cape Cod, and here is an intercept that's in progress. The tracks of the 2 aircraft are going to be coming together, and hopefully there's a bad guy that might get splashed. Anyway, all this computing power and the resources and all the rest are useless unless there's an effective way to shoot down bad guys. And while the SAGE system was being designed and built, the Air Force put out a contract for an advanced fighter to integrate all this capability. And after years of effort, it's government operation, the effort bogged down. The required technology just simply wasn't available. So in the interim, the F-102 Delta Dagger was introduced to less than enthusiastic reviews. It was overweight, underpowered, didn't have half the SAGE capabilities it needed. So, but it did the stopgap. It is something. Finally, in '58, the true ultimate interceptor was delivered. The F-106 Delta Dart is still, to this day, from 1958, the fastest single-engine aircraft ever built. Carried nuclear-tipped air-to-air missiles and was fully integrated into SAGE. Its capabilities were fully integrated, as we were talking about in that crazy scenario at the beginning of the talk. This easily a quick overview of its capabilities would easily be confused in the 21st century. This is the cockpit of the 106, the 6 as they referred to it. That situational display is right below the stick. And the magic of this aircraft was its sophisticated computer. It had a digital computer built in from Hughes that controlled just about everything. Again, this was all designed in the mid-50s. Had miniaturized vacuum tubes, about 450 of them. It had a drum storage for all the navigation and intercept data. It took care of the uplinks from Sage, displayed them on the screen, steered the plane, managed the radios, all in a 16K machine. It's amazing what we had capabilities of. Now, again, with all of this fancy stuff, here you have an airplane designed in the 50s. All the other airplanes, after 10, 20 years, and mostly after about 15 years, almost all of them were scrapped. The F-106 kept flying until the mid-80s, 1986. And the last unit was the Air Guard base in Atlantic City. Now, and we're getting close on time. How well did Sage perform? Well, in the beginning, not as well as it was hoped, but given, this was a vast, brand new technology. Yeah, that might not have been a surprise. If you remember the shutdown of the airspace on 9/11 and how unprecedented it was, well, it wasn't. It wasn't the first time we shut down all the airspace in the United States. Starting in 1960, there was an annual exercise called Sky Shield, which was intended to run all through the United States. We would shut down all air traffic for a day, all the airlines, all the private pilots. No one could be in the air, so we could test Sage. And the airlines were really on board about that. They turned it into a big festival. That was kind of surprising. Hundreds of bombers participated in the exercise. And a similar number of fighters were tasked to shoot down, as we think of, the bad guys, incoming bombers. Because, we're all good friends, the RAF, the UK, wanted to try out their new fighter bombers, the Vulcan. This was absolutely, again, like the F-106, absolute state-of-the-art for a bomber. Now, the RAF got their orders and, well, decided to ignore some of the details. They flew a completely unexpected bombing profile, and they had extremely good radar jammers, and they flew their attacks essentially unchallenged by the American fighters and Sage. Now, thinking that was a one-off, they were invited in 1961 to participate again. And again, easily, they got to their targets. Ultimately, the Air Force realized that we need to upgrade radars to keep that level of jamming from completely shutting down the air defense system. Ultimately, Sage was obsolete the day it went live. The new threat from the Soviet Union was now ballistic missiles, not bombers. And because of its huge cost, Sage cost the taxpayers $2 billion a year. That's about 25 billion, again, depending on your inflation, maybe about 50 billion a year today to keep operational. Honestly, the money was better spent elsewhere. Some of the Sage centers were closed down just a couple years, 5-7 years after they were built. Still, the last system survived until 1984. Think of that, 1984. Now, the role of air defense has grown and matured and is certainly more capable than Sage. But we're kind of left to wonder, with all that prowess expended on developing this amazing system, did any of it spill over into our lives? I mean, we've seen light pens and core memory and all the rest. Was there anything else that we got out of all that money and effort spent? Well, the primary benefactor was IBM. It was the prime contractor for the hardware. And with the knowledge that it gained from its work with MIT, it just simply leapfrogged the competition. through its understanding of advanced electronic design and core memory and all the rest, it started introducing brand new lines of computers, starting with the IBM 704, and that went up to the 7090. The software effort for Sage was massive, about 500,000 lines of code overall for running the system and its infrastructure. This gave IBM invaluable experience in large software applications, and it used its pool of now experienced Sage programmers. But the crazy thing that's equally dramatic as a spinoff from Sage, one day as Sage was being put together, an IBM vice president had a chance meeting with the CEO of American Airlines. Now, in the 1950s, understand there was nothing computerized. When you made a flight reservation, clerks had to run to a paper card catalog, just like the old style library card catalogs. Find a flight, add your name, take care of all the billing and all the rest. If you were doing a complex routing with a lot of stops, reservations could take an hour or two just to book one flight. You couldn't get a lot of the reservation clerks all working together because they were all crowding around the same card catalog. The two executives realized that Sage, much of its operation was the same thing as an airline reservation system. And IBM was then contracted to create what ended up being called the Sabre reservation system. And Sabre exists today through restructurings and rewrites and spinoffs, and obviously it's not the same system, but now we know Sabre, which came out of Sage, as Expedia and Travelocity. Now, if you've ever wanted to see a Sage system, we're going to wrap up here. And, you know, they have bits and pieces of it at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View. But if you don't want to travel that far, again, pandemics are a bitch, just turn on your TV. In the 1960s, a movie prop house grabbed a lot of the frames that came out of one of those decommissioned Sage systems, and especially the maintenance consoles. There is probably no other prop in history that screams computer more than the maintenance console. You can see it here off to the right in that classic, my favorite show, The Time Tunnel. And it also shows up in just about every other Irwin Allen sci-fi show. It made appearances in Lost and Airplane, and name your favorite, again, sci-fi movie. It was in Lost, Airplane. It was even in Woody Allen's Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Sex. In total, about 100 movies and TV shows have showcased Sage. And, it's the computer that keeps on giving. Whoops, let's see what we can do here. Anyway, I'm sorry for making this so fast and all the rest, that sometimes there's so much to talk about and there's so little time. And so what do you say we open this up for conversations?